I'm really honored to introduce him to all of you. He's a professor of sociology at San Jose State University and also the criminal justice chair at the NAACP of San Jose and Silicon Valley. Among many other social issues that he studies and that his work addresses, inequality and youth, racism, anti-racist action, and transformative education are some of them. He's going to speak about how legitimizing any oppressive system, such as caste or racism, is a human rights issue fundamentally, and how this legitimization paves the way for the exploitation of some of our most vulnerable populations. I invite Dr. Armaline to take the stage.
Thanks. I'm going to sit if you don't mind. So, first of all, I just want to say I'm beyond honored to be here. I'm already having a great time with everybody. I loved the last presentation, fam. If you are welcome in my class anytime. When y'all graduate, you want to come to Dr. Armaline's class, please, please, please come, right? Students like that is who I want in my classrooms. So yeah, I'm just giving y'all love. Just saying, like, you are welcome in my classroom any day of the week, now or later, anytime. All right. And I'll say that in general, the CSU may not like me saying it, but my classrooms at least are open doors. You want to come into a class I'm teaching, let me know. You can come in. Folks bring their kids, folks bring their friends. Like I think that's the way it should be. And as long as you don't get me in trouble, we'll keep doing it like that. So anytime you want to come, please come. That said, like I said before, it's a real honor for me to be here, and I really want to be responsible. And the first thing I want to say is I'm honored to be here as somewhat of an outsider, right? So I'm not an expert in the sociocultural history of caste. I'm not. I'm very, very interested in learning more and more and more about these things, and that's one of the reasons I'm here. So I'm here in a couple capacities. First, I'm here as representative of the NAACP. My president, Reverend Moore, sends his love and regards. He's going through some medical stuff right now. He's fine, but he's taking care of some things right now. So he wanted me to send his love and his support and our support organizationally for what you all are doing and what you're trying to achieve. And so, number one, I want to share the solidarity of our organization and of our people. Number two, I'm here, as you said, so I'm the founding director of the Human Rights Institute at San Jose State, the human rights program there. Fortunately, they finally let me step down. So I have an amazing replacement in Dr. Michael Dow, who's taken over the Institute. But it's been my pleasure to build that here. And I'm here representing the Institute as well and representing our faculty and students who are very much with you in these struggles. So just want to speak to that quickly before I get into all this nerd stuff, and I am going to get into some nerd stuff. So when some really wonderful members of the organization came and met with me, they asked if I could share some things that we're working on. Our book manuscript, I'm actually sweating under a September 15th deadline right now. So I am deeply in writing the rest of the book, and my hope is to share a little bit of that with you and how some of these struggles fit into that framework. So moving right along here. So if it's okay with you, I'd like to introduce the scholarship of myself and my co-authors, and that's Bandana Perkayastha and Davida Silfen Glasberg from University of Connecticut, by sharing some excerpts from our upcoming book manuscript. From there, I can speak to how forms of caste discrimination fit into a broader critical framework of capitalist society, or capitalism as a global institutionalized social order that as a whole represents the most considerable challenge to universal human rights practice and the survival of human rights, to the survival of human civilization as we know it. Not to be too dramatic for a Saturday. I'd also like to land on a more pragmatic conversation about the tensions between cultural relativism and universalism that undergird this debate over anti-caste discrimination in bills like SB 403, and let's see where that conversation takes us. So our contribution, and by that I mean myself and my amazing co-authors, who are also, by the way, like my aunties and mentors and former professors, and Bandana has taught me what little I do know about Indian history and culture I owe to Bandana and some of my other colleagues. So I feel very fortunate to work with them. But at any rate, our contribution has been the development of the critical sociology of human rights and concepts like the human rights enterprise, human rights praxis, and now overlapping threats to human survival. In our view, human rights struggles are best understood as power struggles, specifically class struggles and boundary struggles like those against racism, colonization, or caste discrimination that through coercion and political subjugation provide expropriated forms of capital and labor for the capital accumulation process. Indeed, expropriated labor and capital provides what we and Marxist feminist scholar Nancy Fraser call a necessary background condition for capital accumulation itself. One of the overarching goals of our scholarship is to offer critical sociological perspectives on the limitations and potentials of human rights as a body of law, form of discourse, conceptual framework, and social practice. Briefly in review of our previous work, we've been working on this for a good decade at this point. We've argued that many of the most prevalent, systemic, and devastating human rights abuses all over the world are caused by, one, the short-term accumulation interests of corporate and finance capital, often out of a competitive necessity to externalize any and all costs and risks of their activities to other firms, the state, and most often, the public, wherever and however possible. And number two, the actions or inactions of states that are instrumentally captured by blocks of capital and structurally constrained by their position relative to the global capitalist system, and it will be discussed here as the background relations or conditions of possibility necessary for capital accumulation, including systems like racism or patriarchy and the violent geopolitical relations of empire and neocolonialism. Finally, an analysis of the human rights enterprise, and the human rights enterprise, again, is a concept out of our work in studying the history of human rights, or the contested historical process through which human rights are defined and realized in the lives of actual people and communities, reveals that first, human rights struggles are best understood as power struggles. And number two, these struggles are almost always waged against or in spite of the state charged with rights protections in the first place. That last sentence got me blackballed out of publishing in human rights for the first 7 years of my career. Just that sentence. That was so upsetting, and not the fact that I was also coming as a sort of Marxist perspective, completely kept me out of the conversation, and we had to fight our way in. So this is the kind of thrust of our work. Indeed, formal human rights law constructs states as the primary guarantors responsible for realizing human rights obligations articulated to human rights instruments, assuming the willingness and ability of state parties to choose the provision of universal human rights practice, including when in real or perceived conflict with capital accumulation or other interests of elites. The central role of states has much to do with the fact that international law and the UN Charter were all legitimated through treaties between sovereign nation states formed under a Western liberal political order since the world wars of the 20th century. Regardless of origin, a critical sociological analysis of the human rights enterprise demonstrates that this misunderstanding of the state, as sufficiently unfettered by capital and other structural forces to protect, respect, protect, and fulfill the rights articulated in human rights instruments, is a fundamental limitation of international human rights law and points to capitalism and its background relations as the primary impediments to universal human rights practice and primary drivers of what we call overlapping threats to human survival. Those overlapping threats to human survival at this point undeniably are climate change and its associated ecological destruction and the absolute sort of looming specter of nuclear apocalypse. Those are overlapping absolute threats to human civilization as we know it right now at a heightened stage than any other point in human history. And on that nuclear front, by the way, we are closer to nuclear war right now, today, this moment, than ever before in all of history, including the Cuban Missile Crisis, including the first test of the first thermonuclear weapon. I can go into that in detail if you like. So anyway, what does all this mean? How does this apply here? So it illustrates that to the extent human rights come to be ensured through state policy and practice or other means of community power or mutual aid, this is almost always the result of actual social struggles and movements that navigate and shift relations of power, just like the one that you're engaged in right now. So again, how does this apply here? Why would I go through all of this like goofy, highfalutin language in front of you, especially after an abundantly clear presentation from our young folks, not just to bore you to death. But theoretically, caste discrimination joins systemic racism, which, as our last presenters pointed out, has some similarities, has some areas of overlap, but is absolutely different and distinct so caste discrimination and systemic racism are interesting in this way. and forms of ethno-nationalism as forms of economic oppression and political subjugation that are ultimately split up people in place, such that some are rights-holding, free wage laborers, full rights holding, human rights, constitutional rights within that country. They are perceived as full members of that society without any sorts of distinction. And they're, of course, still subject to exploitation. But then you have these other groups that through caste, through race, through ethno-nationalism, and through other means of separation get categorized into the expropriable. So what do I mean by expropriation? Expropriation refers to confiscation, theft, violence, and other forms of subjugation and oppression that are much above and beyond what we would understand under Marx as exploitation for the accumulation of capital. And so it's important to point out that capitalism has depended on these mechanisms, racism, caste discrimination, and ethno-nationalism, from its inception. And I can't stress that enough. And this is a process that Marx called primitive accumulation. Now, I see a lot of nods in the head, nodding in the room from folks that have had some Marx education before. And for those that haven't, it doesn't matter. I'm going to read this one little section because it's relatively famous, but I also think relatively beautiful, and hopefully I have time to do that. So quickly from our book, now I'm going to get into that quick excerpt from Marx and wrap up here. So primitive accumulation refers to the violent process through which land and other publicly shared resources or commons were closed or taken from feudal serfs in Europe, sort of at the end of the feudal era and what would be the beginning of mercantile capitalism in the West. This created a landless proletariat out of former peasants that would now have to rent themselves as wage laborers to survive, and commodifying formerly public lands and resources for the new private capital markets. This process included the often genocidal stealing or expropriation of land and resources from indigenous populations through competitive colonial expansion of European empires into the Western Hemisphere, Africa, including of course, the transatlantic slave trade, Asia, and the Pacific. According to Fraser, quote, expropriation works by confiscating human capacities and natural resources and conscripting them into the circuits of capital accumulation. In this last sense, expropriation differs from pre-capitalist forms of plunder. So it's not that these forms of like theft and plunder and confiscation did not predate capital. It's that once they became intermingled with capital, just like these things of systemic racism and other social systems like patriarchy, they form what we refer to as a symbiotic co-constitutive connection or structural imbrication, through which it's really hard to disentangle them at that point, regardless of their somewhat exclusivity and their somewhat exclusive histories beyond that. So again, in Capital Volume 1, Marx clearly recognizes the conquest of indigenous populations, what we'll call forms of expropriation, as part of his initial process of primitive accumulation, the central role of state violence in that process, and how the process plays out is also according to geopolitical or imperial competition. And this is that beautiful quote from Capital that so many have quoted, but I'm going to quote again here because I think it's just so poetic. He writes, "The discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, signaled the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings are the chief moments of primitive accumulation. These methods depend in part on brute force, e.g. the colonial system, but they all employ the power of the state, the concentrated and organized force of society, to hasten, hothouse fashion, the process of transformation and of the feudal mode of production into the capitalist mode, and to shorten the transition. Force is the midwife of every old society pregnant with the new one. It is itself an economic power." So to be clear, this is not to say that systemic racism or the construction of caste or patriarchy, for that matter, as a social system, are reducible to their structural imbrication or interconnection with the material relations and accumulation drive of capitalism. This is not some class reduction view of those histories. They have their own histories, ontologies, and manifestations beyond an overlap with capital. However, we do need to understand their connections to one another are symbiotic and co-constitutive. Second, note that the fight against caste discrimination is a grassroots fight, where, as I understand it, the biggest challenge has been the economic and political power of the opponents and their influence over the policymaking process. Note their success so far in removing the explicit reference to caste from the bill language in SB 403. What's this all about? This is the human rights enterprise in action. There is a grassroots resistance and organizing campaign from impacted stakeholders like yourselves and their allies against a group whose power comes from their relation to capital, in this case, very, very powerful tech and related forms of capital in a transnational circuit, and their allies against a group who comes from through a social system of caste that together give them a certain influence over the state, and a couple policymakers that I'm sure some of us can name today. This is no surprise given the relationship between capital and the state, and any strategy to counter resistance to legislation like the changes to SB 403 will ultimately have to confront that reality. Third and finally, because I'm almost out of time here, the controversy over caste discrimination is somewhat troubling from an international human rights perspective. All of our fundamental human rights in their actual application must reflect some level of universalism, that the rules and rights on some level apply to everybody, and room for cultural interpretation or relativism for international human rights law to function. This is because the foundation of international human rights is ultimately that of consensus, and human rights function out of a willingness of the world's peoples to participate in an effort from the international community to shed light on situations where violations occur. The way this tension would typically play out in the case of caste in the US, in my view, is as follows. First, under one's constitutional and human rights to free expression and to religious thought, one can believe and conduct religious practice or speech in whatever way they see fit, no matter how heinous any of us might think those beliefs are or those practices may be. This would include the religious and cultural construction of caste and the broader religious and cultural traditions behind it. However, those rights have boundaries, as all rights have boundaries by definition. Every single one of them. There is no exception to that. Under both constitutional and international human rights law, one of those boundaries is when exercising said right results in the systematic fundamental rights violations of others. Even under the ridiculously expansive interpretations of Christian religious freedom in US case law today, one can imagine all kinds of religious practices that would under no circumstances be lawful. In fact, there are horrific practices detailed in the biblical Christian canon that by no stretch of the imagination would be allowed in modern society. Everything from stoning to all kinds of other things I can get into if you like. The question here is an empirical one to the existence of identifiable forms of discrimination, regardless of the religious or cultural foundations of the practice. Period. End of statement. Further, to suggest that confronting forms of caste discrimination would itself amount to or open the door to the demonization or discrimination against Indians and South Asians wholesale seems frankly ridiculous. It is a similarly disingenuous argument as those who claim that criticism of the abhorrent Israeli apartheid regime is akin to anti-Semitism or criticism of Jews or Judaism. And it's the job of people like myself to make these distinctions abundantly clear. And that's what I hope to do today, and I'm very happy to be here. Thank you. That was way too much in a little time. I read way too fast. Sorry about that.
That was definitely a whirlwind. I think we all got a very broad sense of your work. But I want to narrow it down
Please.
to what you said, actual application of human rights and how it relates to your work at the NAACP. Before I ask that question, I want to go to the audience and say you have small sheets of paper, pens on your tables. You can write down your questions. Please add your name to the question and hand that sheet of paper to the volunteers whose hands are raised here. And I will go to those questions after I have some of my own here. So to get your work with the NAACP and the Black Lives Matter movement,
Sure.
and what do you see as the common demands between what the racially oppressed people are in the United States and the caste oppressed people are? how can we come together to place those common demands? Can we find more common ground? Why are we not doing that as much as we could? What is stopping us? How could we get there?
So I'll start by saying I absolutely don't have all the answers to those questions, but I can give some of our thoughts. So I'll cover the nerd part first. So with how we're coming to understand how these things all connect in the way that I talked about it moments ago, these struggles, whether it be anti-racist struggles or struggles against caste discrimination, are similar in that they are, as I said, human rights struggles that manifest as power struggles. In other words, the underlying issue in terms of rights distribution are the power differentials between these groups of folks, and there are very specific sort of structural foundations of those power differentials, right? And so if we're talking about race, for example, there is a long history that we could talk about, and we teach this in our classes, and these eras of systemic racism in the West and how that came about, and it has a very unique ontology and history. And struggles along those lines are human rights struggles, and they are power struggles against that system, against those forces. Caste discrimination, though it comes from a very different history and context, in its overlap with the broader aspects of American society and also with these sort of political economic systems of capital, end up playing a very similar role, right? In that both systemic racism and caste discrimination set apart these distinctions between people who are free labor, fully rights-holding citizens that are treated as such, and those who, again, are subject to expropriation, are subject to systematic discrimination, confiscation, theft, sexual violence, political subjugation, political silencing. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And so in my view and in our view, the shared understanding of that creates also a shared experience and a point of potential solidarity between those that are fighting those systems, right? And so that's a really nerdy way of me saying is solidarity is necessary in the American context to fight these, what I view as on some level distinct, but on many levels very, very interconnected social struggles. Does that make sense? So one of the reasons you see me here today, right, is that we as an NAACP see an absolute, not just out of pure ethics and morals, but just a political strategy. There is real advantage to us learning from each other and building solidarity with one another in a place where the folks who are fighting the kinds of change that we are both trying to achieve are able to do so from a similar power position, right? From their relative position to capital and their relative position to these other forms of power, be they white supremacy or caste. And so there are ways for us to begin to communicate and work with one another as we get to these very practical issues like SB 403. Why would the NAACP want to support anti-caste discrimination? Well, because we are strengthening the law and the legal methods through which we can fight forms of systematic discrimination in our state. That's a benefit to all of us.
So one of the other things you pointed to was that we need to form movements that actually shift power hierarchies. And one of the struggles that we face today as movement builders is a lot of people who are tired out after a day of work go back home and they want to do something, but they look at these big philanthropists and who they see doing some good work and give them money, right? A lot of us resort to that kind of work to help people in distress. But philanthropy is interesting in the sense that it keeps the power structures exactly the way they are, because these philanthropists dole out little money to people who absolutely need it, and just enough so that the power structure doesn't change and they remain right on top. The BLM movement did a really good job to bring people on the streets to try to change that hierarchy, which most philanthropy does not do. How did that happen? How do we make more of that happen?
Let's see, I have to be careful what I say here. Because I have my own, and in fact, the book will also share some criticisms of the Black Lives Matter movement, and they are significant. So let me say that first, is that we need to be very clear-eyed and egoless in our reflection on our movements, because we're not doing ourselves any favors, telling a rosy story, particularly when we didn't succeed. Black Lives Matter did a lot of things except for the things it was supposed to do. So we have to be very honest with ourselves about, well, what's that about? One of the reasons that happened is because it became hijacked by movement celebrities who then began enriching themselves, and the nonprofit complex that began enriching themselves, and then the party politicians came in sniffing all that money and all those bodies. And once that happened, it was game over. I say that with a great deal of grief. I know personally some of these people that have, let's say, made not so wonderful decisions relative to the movement and have been personally, not just professionally, disappointed in those kinds of things. So I want to say that from jump. We have no perfect movements right now. We have to really be very critical and clear-eyed about how we think about it. But let's learn from that lesson, right? So what are some of the things that they did wrong? And it speaks to your question. I thought it was a wonderful question when you emailed me as well. So I'm not big on philanthropy, and this is a high philanthropic place. And I'll use this, and I can say this now because I don't have to ask for anybody's money anymore. I don't run an institute anymore. I don't care. So you have a place like Silicon Valley Foundation, all these multi-billion-dollar foundations. You know what they do with their money? Nobody does. That's the thing. They just kind of hang on to it. And it's a real great tax write-off slush fund for rich people to, throw some money toward good stuff, really not have it go anywhere politically, and still get to write it off all their taxes and buy another Tesla and whatever the hell they do with it. So, I think this notion of philanthropy is not the way. I think the better way to think about this is gathering and building resource and capital for your own movement and for your own autonomy. So in other words, my immediate response to your email was, I would not think about philanthropy, I would think about investment in your organization, investment in your own people, your own organization, your own movement building. And that's what Black Lives Matter was before it became corrupted. Just like that's what the Black Panther movement was very early on. That's what many of these movements were very early on. They invested in themselves, in their own power and solidarity and autonomy. And there's all kinds of ways to do that. And so there's one example that I'll give, and I apologize if this is running on. So the whole Google move, right? So the Google move into San Jose and Santa Clara County was a massive negotiation. I'll put giant air quotes on that because I don't know if that's the word that I would use. But in that negotiation, what did the people of San Jose win? Nothing. The kinds of things that were negotiated were things like, oh, you'll get service sector jobs that, by the way, they were going to have to give you anyway. They weren't going to hire people from another state to come in and do $12 an hour service work. So congratulations, San Jose politicians and folks who are involved in that, which, again, they've heard this from me as well. You negotiated nothing. And what did Google get? Google got capital. Capital C, capital. Land. Public land, and a lot of it. Why couldn't we ask for that? Why didn't a single neighborhood ask for a neighborhood land trust? Nobody. So I'll say enemies, I know who they are for me. My enemies know what they're doing. They know what power is, they know it means capital, they know it means real resource, they know it means these material relations. All that other stuff's symbolic nonsense at the end of the day, they don't care about. They'll put it on a commercial and they're done. And again, look where we are today. What is San Jose getting from that deal? Nothing. And they're getting, I mean, they're still holding strong. They still might even not go through with the deal because they didn't get enough. And so again, what is the sort of perspective of these big tech companies and their workers and all that about how they do contribute in this community? And what are they going to say? Philanthropy. And they love that all day, because philanthropy means we still control everything and you are left to beg and you are subject to our generosity. And what that sets up is a lie. It sets up this lie that they are somehow here in this, as these benevolent actors socially, here just for the good of our community and for the good of providing their services to the world, which is all nonsense. They're here for a reason, like other companies come here for a reason. They don't want to leave, otherwise they would. They have the power to leave. They don't need you in that way, or me. So they're here because they want to be. And we have to start treating those things that way. And I'm just offering this as an example instead of just standing here and giving you this academic kind of response about, yeah, philanthropy is nonsense. I want to show you why philanthropy is nonsense. Because again, if this is a power relation and you're accepting philanthropy, what's changed about the power relation? Unless they're giving you all of their money, nothing. You are still subject to their whims, their power, their decisions, and not only that, they're going to have you star in their commercial to everybody else. Right, for free. For free. And to witness our current CIA commercials and all these other kinds of things.
Thank you. That was definitely illuminating, a very, very local example. I have some audience questions here. Can someone pass the mic to Sarita? She had a question about the competition between African Americans and Asians here in the US.
Hi, thanks. I'll keep it quick, but my question was about solidarity, and how do you or the NAACP think through this really common narrative about African Americans and Asian Americans being in competition within a larger framework of white supremacy? And I'm thinking about the Supreme Court rulings on affirmative action.
It's a really good question, and I'm trying to think about the easiest and quickest way to answer it. So already there was a wonderful comment made in the previous panel regarding model minority stuff, and there's a very specific history to that that's very important to understand, I think. So the model minority concept comes from a very specific point in U.S. history, and it was the point after the sort of second period of rebellion in the United States, or what we call a sort of second Reconstruction, that, and Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor writes about this, so what's referred to as the urban riots of the late 1960s, right? So these urban rebellions in the 60s that were rebelling against actually things like poor housing conditions, poverty, unemployment, and these sorts of things, not just racism. It was actually a mix, and this is part of the things King was speaking to. And so the model minority myth comes out of this attempt by white politicians at the time to say basically the following. See, black people are exactly who we told you they were. As soon as they're upset with something, they act as animals, as uncivilized, they tear the streets up, they burn down their own neighborhoods, all these things. However, look at the quote-unquote Asian minorities. They work hard, they keep to, now all this is bullshit, by the way, like none of this is true, but this is what was said. They keep to themselves, they keep their head down, they work hard, they help each other out, they stick in they're not out there burning the cities down. See, they're a model minority. Those white politicians didn't give two shits about those Asian populations. They were doing that as a comparative analysis, right? To criminalize the people who were out in the street, really in purposeful forms of rebellion, not riots. And so there's been a very long time of anti-racist movements and left movements really suffering from some of those fractures that resulted from that. And it's a much more complicated story than I have time to tell, obviously, and I'm not one of the experts on that. But what I will say is one of the beautiful things of the contemporary movement and the movement since, and this is one thing that I think Black Lives Matter did achieve. So Black Lives Matter, these movement strategists were really, really bright already, and we're already kind of like hip to intersectionality and all of that. And we're already doing things like organizing with Palestinians, organizing with the Palestinian resistance, or actually going to Palestine, actually going and seeing what are the shared experiences, and not just like in terms of personal experience that, by the way, we tend to fetishize a bit, but also in terms of our understanding of structure, understanding that just like the Indian and United States military states, the Israeli and U.S. police and military states are deeply interconnected. And so wanting to understand that more and work on that more. And I think that these kinds of moments in our recent movement history have opened the door much, much, much more to the solidarity across these fractures that have historically existed. And I hope that speaks enough to your question, but that's my optimistic position right now.
I'm going to call on Maha to ask her questions about what's the alternative.
Thanks for the very insightful debriefing. So my question is actually, given that more and more human rights struggle we witness in the current day and time, it's contradicting to think of the fights in the capitalistic world as being the only solution. What should movements focus on? My broader question is like, I'm struggling to grapple around the idea of fighting and trying to fit into the power-mongering capitalistic structures that consistently empower neo-colonial power structures. Should we fight the structure or should we break out? And if the breakout seems to be a good idea, but then what is the imagination of a world which is not in the current format?
Yeah.
Because I like to ask Marxists also this question because you do a lot of analysis into understanding this current framework. So if there's an alternate view of or imagination you have, I would like to hear.
Well, first of all, I think imagination is a key word here. And I don't, I think theory is wonderful in that it guides us, but it should never trap us, right? So just because I'll say like, yeah, I think Marx has some things to offer here and things like that, doesn't necessarily mean you become trapped in that as a single mindset, right? And you have to be able to think and move outside of that. So I think imagination is key. I want to be very clear about one thing though. I don't think we're at a point where this sort of breakaway or this, I don't know what that means. I don't know what that looks like in today's world. I don't know, there's no, the nature of the transnational nature of financialized capital at this point is one such that there is no escaping it. There is no outside. If anyone can tell me where the outside is, I'd love to know. I don't know where outside that system is. So you can convince yourself you're doing that, but I don't think you in fact are. So I don't even know that that's worth thinking about as anything other than a sort of thought exercise. And so I think what we have to turn to is how do our immediate needs and struggles begin to sort of like scale up to these other kinds of things. And that's the kind of, frankly, patience and work that really needs done for a movement to succeed. And so fortunately for us, I think there are very, very exciting opportunities when we see the labor movement. And that is becoming increasingly multiracial, multi-ethnic, and increasingly flexible in terms of getting into some of these other social and cultural issues. So you see labor stepping in on issues of race. You see labor stepping in on issues of criminal justice. You see labor stepping in. You see labor stepping in on some of these international issues as well in terms of colonization, right? And I can give all kinds of examples of that if you like. Now, is it built and militarized to the point that someone like, I would be happy? Oh, far from it. But you're asking about the work that needs to be done. So, in my view, I'm kind of old school in this way. I think we need to be organizing all of our workforces. I think we need to be building these labor struggles, and I think we need to be doing them in such a way, and this is, I think, going to be better answering your question. So there's a big well, it's not an either or, right? But there is a debate, particularly in not just the black community, but in progressive politics, around identity politics versus these other things, and things like reparations and universal programs. I am on Team Universal Program, and I'm going to tell you why. And it's for the reason that you ask. I think history, and Dr. King is an embodiment of that history, tell that the best ways and the most powerful ways that cross-race and ethnicity, or any of these distinctions, solidarity has been built, has been in the actual pursuit of material interests together. That does not rely on simple moral or religious construction. It doesn't rely on us liking each other all the time. It doesn't rely on those things, but that we are actually building meaningful solidarity toward a shared material goal, that its output also impacts power relations. Something like Medicare for all does those things. And I'm happy to spell that out in its complexity if you like. Whereas some of these other things, I mean, we could talk about the reparations conversation in California that will never, ever get off the ground. That is a guarantee from me. I can tell you why. Right? But to me, these are the kinds of things that we have to be prepared to do. And as you hear, that takes a little bit of humility too, because it means like some of these like really, really some aspects of identity and those sorts of things that some folks really, really grip onto pretty strongly, you might need to loosen that grip a little bit, right?
There's a question here without a name, so I'm going to ask it myself. It relates to the... Sorry? There are a bunch of questions here without names, so I'm going to ask them.
By the way, I'll go as long as y'all want. And just tell me when to stop talking. I won't take any offense. Great.
Okay, let's do that. Yeah.
For the great speech. So you started with this idea that the world is facing a significant challenge with ecosystems and nuclear war, and I shouldn't say nuclear because of war. War is funding the nuclear program.
Yeah.
And the second thing was the Marx quote that you mentioned about the exploitation of rural and tribal societies, their economic wealth, culture, and language. Do we have subjective or objective proof that the rise of the right is the contribution factor for either one of them? Because in some ways, the rise of the right is looked at as a humanitarian problem or a sensitivity problem, but could it be the reason ultimately to cause the tribal, rural, social structure, language destruction, cultural destruction, as well as contributing to more wars in terms of creating more nuclear things?
I'm sorry, I misheard the beginning of your question. Could you repeat it one more time?
So could we really relate the rise of the right to
the rights of the right? That's what I don't understand what you're saying.
Rise of the right.
Rise of the right. I'm sorry. Go ahead. That makes more sense. Thank you.
Rise of the right contributes to the rural, tribal, cultural and language and economic destruction, and also contributing to the wars, and then that is what contributes to the nuclear, that is what is contributing to the world order. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. Okay, so from my perspective, certainly from a Marxist perspective, it would I understand this slightly differently, right? So the way that well, first of all, I would say that the right is a very difficult thing you can't just like say the right and like, okay, that's a very complicated thing. So the right here, the international right, the Western right, these are all related but different things, right? So that makes it kind of difficult to answer on sort of a global level. But what I will say is what we've sort of witnessed across history is that as capital, not just capital, but other aspects of sort of a world system go into crisis, we end up with these competing narratives between right and left solutions to that crisis of what's otherwise sort of a liberal regime. And I think we just find ourselves in yet another one of those places. And while, these right, so in other words, we talk about this rise of the right as this form of 21st century fascism. And I don't mean like in the proper fascism sense, but sort of in a softer conceptual sense, right? And we see that as part of the problems coming out of the crisis of capital and its prices of its background relations, like the ecological crisis and things like that. And as that occurs, people will move to these right and left-wing sort of forms of populism, forms of trying to change that system through popular movement, but in one or two of those directions, sort of right or left. And it's more complicated than that, but I'm trying to be good to answer your question. And so for me, it's part of it, but it's not the driving force. And in other words, it's very difficult for me to understand, I'd be happy for someone to point it out, how it's the other way, right? So I can see the rise of the right wing arising out of these conditions of crisis and capital, but I don't see how those right-wing figures are actually the ones in the driver's seat, and those right-wing forces are actually driving that necessarily. What we find in history is actually the autocrats and authoritarians and things like that are in service of capital, not the other way around. Xi Jinping is no different. And that's the beauty of Marx and what he tells us. Because, by the way, everyone's in the capitalist system now. You can call yourself whatever you want, but once you hit the international stage, it's capitalism, period. And China is 1,000% a participant in that capitalist system, full on, full go. Call it whatever you want, but it's still what it is. And so, right, so is the increasing authoritarianism of China because of some purely cultural direction toward authoritarianism, or does that have more to do with China's role on the global economic stage? I would argue it's more to do with the latter than the former. Yeah.
I'm going to call on Yarini to ask the next question.
Hi, I'm really enjoying the whole discussion right now. I wanted to
You're very
ask
kind.
the role of global capitalism and the inflated military budget on what you were saying about the impending nuclear threat.
Beautiful question, because that's actually what the book really goes into, is the central argument. So if you then were to ask me, well, Dr. Armaline, what's the biggest thing we got to do in the United States and da-da-da-da, one of the biggest things that we need to do is directly confront our military and police state. And there's a reason. Because our military and police state plays a very particular role in that transnational capitalist system, not just for the United States and owning class here, but for the global owning class, the transnational capitalist class. All employ American military might now, right, to do these things. And it's so on one level, if we're concerned with the sort of onslaught of capital accumulation and what it does in terms of its drives and these sort of violent processes of expropriation that I talked about before, well, it's our military that does most of it, and it equips others to do the rest of it. So we as Americans are most responsible for and able to address that military spending and that military adventurism. And so in my view, that's our responsibility to do, because other people can't do that, right? Like if you live somewhere else, like, you can think whatever you think about American militarism. Good luck doing anything about it. You're not gonna. Only American taxpayers are gonna be able to hold that beast to account. Now, the other reason that it's a big danger is because, as you know, the world is becoming increasingly multipolar, and the world is becoming destabilized because of these sort of crises that are arising, ecological and otherwise. And so, like I said earlier, we're on the precipice of nuclear disaster because of all of those conflicts so close to breaking out, some of which we're not involved in, but many of which we are, namely what McCoy calls a competition between the sort of the fall of the American hegemony and the rise of China for a new world order. Now, I don't mean that in the sort of conspirative right-wing GOP way that we would mean it here, some xenophobic, this is fear of China or some nonsense. But I just mean in terms of just a very objective understanding of geopolitics and the way that before you know it, you can end up in a major power and nuclear conflict over, for example, Taiwan and the Taiwanese Strait, or for example, right? And I can name many other flashpoints, but for that reason, we would be very wise to start backing that military machine back from the precipice, right? Because we're the only population that can.
The next one's from Rahul about disinformation from
Yeah, thank you. Wanted to ask, start by saying that Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King himself said that he's untouchable of, America, kind of, resembling the status of untouchables in India. Same as the blacks in America, and we had similar. There in India had similar hashtags like Dalit Lives Matter, same as the Black Lives Matter movement came to picture, and for say Dalit atrocities happening in India, which were similar to Black lives, targeted, and their lynching happened. So. In America, there were, the Black Panthers movement came in, and then in parallelly, we had in India the Dalit Panther movement came in. So my question is, despite all that, and Dr. Ambedkar also said that there should be some collaboration between the Afro-American community with the Dalit community, facing the caste discrimination, and this is because more collaboration is needed and more unity with Afro-American professors. Raise the voice that in ABC 10 interview, one upper caste Brahminical minded professor, what he said in an interview that caste system, this interview was regarding why SB 403 came in, and he said that the caste system came to India with the arrival of Portuguese since 1500. So he blatantly lied about caste system happened only because of Portuguese. That was a complete false claim he did, and he's a professor at UC Davis. So you can understand how the mindset of this pillar, and it will be great to collaborate together and make a voice heard about such lies of upper caste and oppressive community professors within America. He is from Indian origin actually. Thank you.
I appreciate. Well, first, I appreciate your entire comment and question. And you're right. There were very interesting parallel movements around the world. Not just solidarity movements, but as you're mentioning, like their own versions of it. They're pushing these issues forward. And I want to speak to disinformation on two levels here, because I think you're bringing up a really interesting point. The first one regarding the professor and these kinds of things, and idiots like me that don't know as much as I need to know as well. I think all of us need to go into these conversations with a great deal of humility, a huge dose of sense of humor, and more than anything, this is, I'll sound kind of goofy or whatever, I don't care, that's what I say in classes too. I think it's my job as a professor to unconditionally love every student in my classroom, no matter what. That's my job. And the way that I go into these kinds of conversations is very similar. I think we need to go into these conversations with an attitude of love and compassion. I don't say that to be like Goofy or Sesame Street or anything like that. I say that because I genuinely think that's what works. And I think that's what actually builds bonds between people. And so I think all of us need to go into like wanting to understand each other's, not just like lives today, but histories and connections to those histories with a kind of excited curiosity. Not like, let me tell you, but I'm really excited to learn about you and get to know you and see what that can tell me about myself and about other things. So I think that's just a kind of an attitude that we need to really be disciplined and hold ourselves to as people. But also with regard to the disinformation, that's something that's impacted both movements in actually very similar ways. So there's a great deal of research right now, and I'm talking about this in the book as well. So if you look at how Black Lives Matter activists were treated by the American police state in terms of surveillance and all kinds of illegal activity, a lot of folks are dead or in jail, by the way, since then. Very similarly, crackdowns on media and activism all over India has been brutal, right? And of some of these exact same organizations, and the strategies being used by the state, whether it's the United States or Modi's regime in India, are essentially the same. They're essentially using the same kind of tactics of not just disinformation, but really criminalizing journalism and really criminalizing the political speech of folks that's just not convenient to allow to speak.
Thank you. Pujit, do you want to go next?
Hi, thank you so much for your discussion. I was thinking about your point of like how it was hard for you to talk about certain topics in like human rights spaces for like 9 years. You described like especially like as like from like a more like class struggle perspective, or like to talk about like capital accumulation in relation to like how human rights operates. And I wonder how things have changed. Like, why did it take 9 years? Like, how does like class struggle in academia like?
It's a really good question. So I don't know that I can tell you all the answers about what changed. I can tell you some things that changed, and maybe there's some other things I'm not aware of. So, one thing that had to happen is just resistance. You just had to have a lot of people just insisting that, like, hey, these are real ideas that you have to, so enough people basically clamoring to do it. And at the time, there's also a power relationship going on at the time. Because I was a graduate student at the time when I was first starting to push this out. And I was at UConn. It was actually publishing one of the highfalutin human rights journals. So there's only really 2 or 3 in the world of those journals. And one of them is published out of there. And at the time, I'm literally arguing with some of my own professors over these issues. And they are the ones that also run the journal. So any of you who are in academia or have been in academia, the power relationship between graduate students and senior professors in an R1 department, and it is not equal by any stretch of the imagination. So you can imagine when they have a student who is already kind of a black sheep in the program, if I'm going to be frank, but is outperforming people and is making them look bad in front of all their colleagues, they're not real happy to publish your work. So, we had to fight. We had to organize an actual debate in a conference on campus where they'd have to air out the issues in front of other people, and that did not go well for them. Did not go well for them. And other people started writing. Other people started writing work, and other sociologists started breaking into the field of human rights that frankly has been dominated by the fields of law, philosophy, and political science and economics that are all overwhelmingly politically conservative fields in the United States. And they are very much play along, go along to get along kind of disciplines in the United States, particularly with regard to capital. So, it's just what it was. But I was also fortunate that social movements were happening throughout those periods that really forced these issues forward, and we kept on it, and eventually, like, they can't keep ignoring you forever when they're obviously incorrect. So I don't know. I'm very fortunate to have other people that were clamoring along as well, and I feel incredibly fortunate that our ideas are out there now, but it was a fight.
Dandapani has a question about lobbying.
For issues like SB 403, I think the first step that we fail is at the lobbying, right? Like, while the other side is having a fat wallet, and I would not hesitate to say grassroots organizations like ours are really poor to defend, right? So what is it legally or in any way possible to stop lobbying or work around that lobbying in first place? Rather than talking about winning or losing it, how do we go about lobbying?
Yeah, so as someone that has had to spend more time with politicians than I would like, but hey, I'm from Youngstown. I'm from a mob town, right? So my understanding of politics and power are from that context, and I also understand that relationships are very meaningful in that context, and you can get a lot done from those relationships. So it's not that I'm against relationships per se, but lobbying is something else. And lobbying is about essentially threats of power. All a lobbyist is someone who's paid to go in there and pressure a politician on behalf of an interest. And that lobby, and there's a skill involved there, absolutely. There's some lobbyists that are really, really good, got really solid relationships with folks, and even if they aren't really holding any real power, they'll convince them that they do. And they're very good at that, right? And they earn their money doing it. But lobbying is also about leveraging real forms of power, right? Being able to walk in that room and say, hey, I make sure you don't win that next election. We got enough people, we're going to make this really hard for you on this. Or, hey, we already give 30% of your campaign donations. That's going to go away for you. So it's to say that these folks really only understand those kinds of realpolitik negotiations. And I think the best way to ensure that your movement or your policy or what have you is going to succeed is to make sure you have some of those things in your pocket, and you have a way that even beyond your relationship with that politician, you can say, hey, beyond our relationship, this is real. And we have a lot of people and a lot of resource that are going to be moving against you if you betray us here. I wish it were different. I wish I could say, well, you know, these folks really do make decisions based on their ethical stances on these issues. That's bullshit. You know that's bullshit. So and they know that's bullshit, even the good ones. And behind closed doors, I can promise you, they admit that, right? But they ain't gonna admit it out in a meeting. So you have to keep that in mind, that like, we have to have the power to not depend on their generosity, whatever that means. And that takes planning and organization and all of those things, but at least if you can get to that point, you're in a different position relative to those conversations. And it doesn't mean you can't still be nice and develop those relationships and all that, but you can be real and you can say, hey, at the end of the day, right, there's brass tacks behind this. This isn't just, you know, discourse and our having coffee, right? I don't know if that answers your question, brother, but I'm doing my best. You know, lobbying is what we're stuck with. And so I think you want to think about how beyond that can you leverage your power when it comes to these policymakers.
I'm going to ask a question of my own here. As somebody who's worked a little bit on education and connected with you, sure. Just before the talk about how much you worked with youth, with children, there's work you've done in the space of holding teachers accountable in spaces where there's systemic oppression and so much outside the school that makes the child perform not so well, and putting all the blame on the teachers and all the blame on the schools and reducing resources in that space. That's happened here in the US in the early 2000s. It's happening today in India. Mm-hmm. And what this is leading to is privatization of schools, the public good. I want you to talk about this a little bit, because it connects so well also with capitalism and how and tying into state lobbying powers and all of these things that we touched upon.
Sure. So just to give a little bit of background, I'm an actual multidisciplinary scholar. I was like, say that. So I was actually a K-12 high school teacher for a while, and I actually also used to teach in education. So my background is in education, sociology, and human rights. So I've taught teachers, so I've taught urban ed and K-12 ed at UConn to aspiring teachers. I also taught for a while in K-12. I also ran a Boys and Girls Club in the, you know, some old neighborhoods back in the Midwest for a while, and I've taught in youth prisons as well, and adult prisons. So education is a very dear to me. It's always been part of my work, and I think a lot about the role of education and educators and all these other sorts of politics that we talk about. And you're absolutely right. So there has been a very successful privatization movement in the United States and elsewhere, in places like India, but not just India. And frankly, privatization has always been the point of the charter school movement, the free choice movement, and all of that. And we've known this as critical educators for decades. This is not controversial to anyone who actually studies it. It's only controversial to the public. So school choice was never about school choice. Charter school was never about helping kids, except that its initial, actually, that's not true. Its very initial inception, charter schooling was actually a progressive idea that was based into the notion of sort of like class and other forms of propaganda in public schools, but then the right wing took hold of it, realizing that it was an opportunity to privatize. And so they've been very successful in that. And as a result, where we are now is that our public schools in the United States are deeply underfunded, and that underfunding then has been used to say, well, see, look, the public schools are falling apart. Public schools are then by themselves crappy, and so we should be getting rid of public schools. You know, it's the same privatization move that they've tried in every other public industry, including the post office, including everything else, where you defund something and you rip out you rip the foundation out from underneath it without telling anybody that that's what you've done, and then you say, look, would you want your kids to go to this? Look at how crappy it is. Well, of course it is. You took all the money out and gave it to corporations so they could teach rich kids. And so what do you end up at the end of that? At the end of the day, what you end up with is a big education system that is essentially not so good, that serves most people. And then you have a kind of tiered private system that provides really high-level education to the kids of the elites, and then also a bunch of stuff that actually also provides really crappy education to the professional class and middle class, pointing out, by the way, that a lot of these charter schools are abysmal failures. Abysmal failures when you look at the graduation rates, when you look at what they're doing with their scores, etc. And I'll also remind people that the educational system in the United States that took the United States to the top of the heap in the world, whether we're talking about the space race or anything else, was a robust public school system. It was not a privatized system. The most powerful American institutions have been on the basis of a very, very well-funded, broadly supported public educational system from kindergarten through college, period. And to the extent that those institutions have eroded, we have seen the prices of that erosion, and it is all around us.
Huge parallels to what is happening in India. And I think Ajanta also spoke about how that happened and how that ties very well with our conversation about race and caste and all of these oppressions that are held stable by exactly what.
And I don't need to educate anybody here on that sort of educational competition that arises out of the privatization of education in India, right? And the way, well, again, I'm not educating anybody here, so I'll stop.
I have one last question that'll go to Sean.
Hey, I am Sean. I'm from Indian Overseas Congress. More than my party, I am representing here as a moderator of 300 people community of Dalits, Muslims, innovators, Indian diaspora, which is Voice for India. This is my question to you as in two folds. One as American and also as an academician who teaches human rights, sociology, interdisciplinary stuffs like social sciences. How do you see Manipur in the context of religious program as well as ethnic cleansing and caste? So I see a conspicuous silence of elected representatives of Indian root. For example, the Vice President Kamala Harris Iyer and India Caucus co-chair Rokana. So both of them are conspicuously silent on this matter. So as a American, how are you seeing this? As an academician who's teaching human rights, how are you seeing Manipur? Thank you.
Okay. I have a feeling we have similar opinions on these decisions. So I've had this conversation with Ro, to his face. And I will tell you, as I will tell everyone, I am brutally honest when I have those conversations about that. What he will say, and what some of these other politicians will say, is it's my job to meet with everyone. It's my job to meet with everyone. It's my job to, and he'll say, Dr. Ambedkar and Dr. King did the same, and you've seen these kinds of things. And I think there's some level of truth to that, and at the same time, I don't know what difference that makes. I don't know how much I care about that. And so my question becomes, well, okay, what's the point of that dialogue then? What is it that you are going to fight for in that dialogue on behalf of these diaspora and on behalf of these issues? And if you don't know the answer to that, I don't think you're ready to talk to those people, right? Now, does this mean all of my advice is taken to heart? Your guess is as good as mine. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But I will assure you, I have been brutally honest in my conversation about not just what I think about those decisions, but about how I know for a fact, because I get these kinds of questions often, they're being interpreted. And I let them know, hey fam, here's how this is being interpreted by your public. And it is not good. And so again, I can tell you I've been trying my best. It's not just this issue, right? Like there are several issues like this, whether it's meeting with the Israelis, whether it's meeting with Modi himself, meeting with, right? These are very touchy kinds of questions and issues, and they're wrapped up in much bigger questions as well. So I'm also very concerned, for example, in the broader geopolitical positioning vis-a-vis India and China. I'm very interested in what we're doing and how we're trying to get our hooks into India in some very interesting ways. And all those conversations have to do with those kinds of relations as well. And it's very difficult to sort of disentangle them. So again, for me, I don't think we can say to folks like, no conversation can happen with these people, because again, it's a head of state, you know what I mean? However, I think we can ask these other questions about, well, what is it that you're actually going to discuss? How is it that you plan on representing the interests of your public, which here is a district in California, right, including us? So I think that's what has to be really, really harped upon. But at the same time, I just want to warn, don't throw too much of your energy into being mad at the politicians all the time. They're going to be what they are. And you yelling at them is not going to change that. What's going to change that is you doing what I said earlier, building actual power such that you don't have to depend on whether or not they agree with you, right? They're going to have to reckon with you. That's different, right? So like I said, I wish you could go on just like, oh, they're a good person, they've made this commitment. That's just not how politics work. I wish it was, it isn't. So you have to think in terms of real power. You have to think in terms of like, how are they forced to reckon with our existence and our demands? And if they're wonderful on top of that, great. But we're not going to depend on that, right?
So time to conclude this session, and I want to do that by first thanking Shakti and Kavina, whose ideas I think if we put into practice will elevate the level of conversation we can have around how we build that future where justice and fairness are front and center. And thank you for, telling us, among a lot of other really important things. I think you said imagination is key, humility is key, sense of humor is key, love, compassion, and solidarity is key. So thank you, and thank you, Shakti and Kavina, for this
really nice to be here.
wonderful, wonderful talk.